For our session today, we'll be talking about ethical editing. And just before we get to that, I wanted to just take a moment to, oh, looks like my screen share has stopped. Please stand by one moment to just begin with a land acknowledgement, just to get us started off, to acknowledge the land that we're coming to you from today. We recognize that many of you may be joining us from different territories. At the University of Calgary, we'd like to acknowledge that we're situated on Treaty 7 territory, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Piikani, Kainai First Nations, and the Siksika, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. And also to pause for a moment to acknowledge that the City of Calgary is also part of the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And with that, I will hand things over to Karen Crosby from Editarians to give us a wonderful presentation on ethical editing as it relates to academic integrity. So she'll cover some important topics. And I'll just start with a brief declaration before she begins to say that I've known Karen for a number of years because I've worked with her and Editarians. And it's because I know of their ethical approach to editing of student and professorial texts that I felt comfortable inviting her today. Karen, I'll hand the mic over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to thank the University of Calgary for the opportunity to address the topic of ethical editing. Also here with us today is Claire Prokopenko, who is our manager of client care and communications. Claire has been instrumental in designing this slideshow and preparing 3 free downloads for you today as supplementary resources. So we'll be sharing a link with you at the end of the presentation to get them if you're interested. I hope that you will participate in our polls and ask any questions that you might have in the chat. So I'll start by giving you a bit of a background into my editing qualifications and experience. We'll define some terms so we're clear on what we mean when we talk about academic writing and academic misconduct. Then we'll dive into the nitty-gritty of today's webinar, namely what is involved in working with a professional editor, and is it ethical if you are a student? What are the roles and responsibilities of students, supervisors, and editors to ensure that editing does not become cheating? What do the guidelines say and why? And I'll then explain what editors do exactly, beyond gloating about the misspelling we found in today's newspaper. I'll explain the 4 types of editing and how they fit with academic writing. And finally, we'll wrap up with some food for thought and a Q&A session. As I give you a bit of background about my editing career, I hope that you will share a bit about yourself in our first poll. Helen has it ready for you. And so for me, after I graduated from the University of Alberta in 1992, with an arts degree, I moved to Japan. There, I began editing government documents. I corrected a lot of so-called English, and in the late 1990s, I was the English supervisor of a bilingual magazine in Tokyo. After returning to Alberta, I started my company in 2002. My very first job was a Master of Arts in Leadership thesis from a Royal Roads University student, and I knew I had found my niche. I soon began working as an editor full-time and then building out my business. I hired other team members, joined the Better Business Bureau, and became a member of Editors Canada. Editors Canada promotes professional editing across the country and currently has over 1,300 members. From 2013 to 2014, I completed Mount Royal University's Professional Editing Certificate. I already knew how to edit, of course, but I wanted to see how a school went about teaching a person to edit. And the following semester, I joined its program advisory committee. Most recently, I have begun mentoring new editors with Editors Canada. So I see in the poll results, we have some faculty and some graduate students. I will also speak to undergraduates during my presentation today, even though there don't appear to be any on the call, but in case there are professors here who teach undergraduate students. So, all right, well, let's start by clarifying some terms. One term we need to understand is academic writing. For our purposes today, I propose we think about scholarly writing as the broader sphere of nonfiction work that serves to advance or disseminate knowledge in a particular field. So here we're talking about books, book chapters, journal articles, and symposium presentations. Academic writing is a subset of scholarly writing that also meets an academic requirement. So here we're talking about course papers, essays, reports, theses, and dissertations. I also want to clarify that when I'm talking about students today, I'm referring primarily to graduate students, because as you can guess from this slide, editing undergraduate work is an ethical can of worms. It is allowed in some circumstances, and there are now guidelines for editing undergraduate work. They came out in 2019, and I will touch upon them later. But I personally don't work with undergraduates. I'm so limited in what I'm allowed to do. And as my client, you're probably going to want me to do a whole lot more. So if you are an undergraduate, you're likely going to find it cost prohibitive and frustrating to work with a professional editor. If you're a graduate student, you may find it frustrating to be a graduate student. You know, we have been editing academic writing for over 18 years now, and a large part of our client base comprises graduate students. We get to read papers on many fascinating topics, which is great for us. Unfortunately, by the time our clients are knocking on our door, they're often burnt out and overwhelmed. They're stressed about getting everything right. They're second guessing, you know, what's correct or what's been overlooked. They're struggling to get their papers structured and organized. And many are, believe it or not, trying to have a life, you know, outside of researching and writing. And all those concerns have weighed them down to the point that they forget why they wanted to get this blasted degree in the first place. You know, let us know in the chat if you know anybody who fits that description. I imagine some of you who are graduate students can relate. So the reasons we love working with graduate students is that, you know, in answering those questions, in filling that support gap for them, their love for their topic gets rekindled, their writing improves. In removing those frustrations, they can focus on expressing their ideas with confidence and peace of mind. We free up their time and they can submit with the satisfaction of knowing that their paper meets all expectations. Well, what does that mean? Meet all expectations. Okay, well, first, you have to pursue a topic of inquiry, and especially at the doctoral level, you're expanding the knowledge in your field or you're pushing disciplinary boundaries. While doing so, you're expected to practice research integrity. Have you met the relevant ethical and professional standards and policies? These would include, for example, the U of C's research integrity policy and the Tri-Council policy statement. Third, have you exercised honest and ethical behavior in your academic pursuits? And finally, in those endeavors, have you met the institution's academic standards? You may be judged on evidence of scholarship, strength of argumentation, relevance of sources, and you may also be marked on the strength of your writing and your adherence to a style guide. So if students are being evaluated on the papers they submit, the question becomes, is it honest to get the help of a professional editor? So to answer that question, let's first understand what is considered dishonest in terms of academic misconduct. The definitions on the next few slides are from the U of C's student academic misconduct policy. And misconduct is any student behavior which compromises proper assessment. Those behaviors include cheating, fabrication, falsification, plagiarism, and unauthorized assistance. I won't belabor these ideas, but relative to hiring a professional editor, we can see that editorial help could be construed as cheating or as unauthorized assistance. So let's look at both in more detail. Cheating is trying to give or gain an improper advantage in academic activities. Examples of cheating include copying another student's work, conversing during an exam, using unauthorized materials, And as we see in item 5, cheating includes obtaining assistance from another person such that there's a real question as to whose work is being assessed. And unauthorized assistance is cooperating, collaborating, or otherwise giving or receiving assistance in completing academic activities without the instructor's permission. Unauthorized assistance is considered academic misconduct because it could give you an unfair advantage. How can your prof judge your academic ability if a third party has made contributions to your work? An obvious example of unauthorized assistance is getting somebody else to write your paper, and you do not have to look far. This is how many results my quick Google search turned up for write my paper for me. There is absolutely no gray area here. This is a deep black hole, and your toes should never be anywhere near the edge of it. So when does editing cross over into cheating? We could say that there's a line between them, and that line is the line of authorial integrity. In other words, the student is the author of the work. The pen must stay firmly in the student's hand. If you're a student, it's your responsibility to conduct your scholarship with integrity. As soon as somebody else is doing the writing, they have crossed that line. It doesn't matter if the person taking the pen from your hand is a parent, a peer, or a professional editor. Anybody taking too heavy a hand with your work is putting you into an ethical gray zone. Okay, well, that sounds straightforward, but in practice, that line can be tricky to find because students aren't operating in a vacuum. Let's look at the key stakeholders in academic writing. At the institutional level, universities set policy and guide faculty on how to implement those policies, including when it's permissible to condone editing. Universities want to attract the best faculty and students, including international students, and the caliber of the theses and dissertation those students produce reflects on the university's reputation. Gone are the days when the only people who read your dissertation are you, your prof, and your mom. And there it sits, bound and glorious, gathering dust on a bookshelf. The rise of portals and databases such as Theses Canada and ProQuest have really extended the reach of graduate student work. And I think that wider dissemination is to be applauded. Graduate students are conducting thought-provoking research. Their results deserve that wider dissemination. But of course, that means that what gets posted lives online for a long time, and its quality reflects not just on the author, but on the faculty, the program, and ultimately the university itself. And plus, there's a wider readership that cannot be forgotten. The whole point of all of this is to transfer knowledge and improve human understanding in some way. And to ensure that piece is solid, students work closely with their supervisors and sometimes other committee members. These expert readers are expected to give editorial feedback that students incorporate into revisions. Supervisors will flag or fix issues in a paper, but they just don't have time to fix everything. They are under their own very real constraints. So they tend to focus on content. They alert the student if the paper lacks rigor, if the literature appears to be dated, if some key knowledge has been overlooked. But once they've approved the content, if they're still stumbling over grammatical or formatting issues, they tend to advise the student to go get an edit. So there's the graduate student whose proposal was approved, who conducted a thorough literature review, who followed research protocols, who collected great data, who analyzed them well, who discussed the findings with insight. In other words, who jumped through every hoop, but who may not be a native English speaker, who may not have an undergraduate degree, who may not be that great at grammar, who may be writing in APA style or whatever style for the first time, and who, remember, is trying to meet all these expectations and keep stress levels out of the stratosphere. And there's been a growing recognition, especially over the last decade or so, that nobody's best interests are being served by letting the student flounder without additional support. Not the schools, not the students, and certainly not the readers who may benefit from this scholarship. The problem is, if you're a student, you've reached the limits of your knowledge. You know some things in your paper need fixing, you're concerned there may be more, and beyond that is the whole sphere of the unknown. You don't know what you don't know. If you've already done your best, given what you do know of the English language, of academic writing, of the style guide you're following, how are you supposed to magically edit your paper better without some support? So what's more is that beyond errors and inconsistencies, tripping up readers and reflecting poorly on everyone, those inconsistencies themselves may be compromising the ideals of ethical scholarship. Let's say your paper is supposed to meet APA style. Many ethical considerations are embedded in the APA manual. One of our free resources for you today that you can download later is an ethical compliance checklist. So you're better equipped to avoid these pitfalls on your own. Here, I'm going to focus on ethical considerations that are frequently overlooked by students and supervisors and found by editors. Common ethical misses include not knowing that you need permission to reprint a figure or to quote a long passage. Maybe you thought it was sufficient to simply cite the source, and it's not. It's easy for age, gender, racial, or other bias to creep into the writing. Or you've not adequately protected confidentiality. Have you given away identifying information that's supposed to be disguised? For example, a few years ago, I read a dissertation on social justice. The writer had interviewed 4 prominent Canadian social justice activists and had anonymized them, but from some of the information given, I was able to identify 2 of them. So in other cases, we find names that have not been removed from interview excerpts that are quoted in the results chapter, or a supposedly anonymized organization can be identified because the student put the mission statement into chapter 1. Some of the most common misses we see have to do with crediting sources. We routinely find sources in the reference list that are not cited in the paper, citations that do not have corresponding entries in the reference list. We find author names misspelled, author names missing, differences in dates of publication. We see quoted material that has no quotation marks around it, or the page number given in the text doesn't even exist in the page range that's given in the references. And these types of misses that we find all the time and that a supervisor is not likely to find constitute plagiarism. This is the U of C's definition of plagiarism from the Student Academic Misconduct Policy. Plagiarism occurs when you present the work of others as your own without proper acknowledgement. What's important to understand is that even if you have inadvertently used a source without proper acknowledgement, you've inadvertently forgotten to put quotation marks around a quote, it counts technically as plagiarism. And we've known, from the time of Middle Earth, that one does not simply copy and paste, without citation. But it's one thing to understand what not to do. It's another thing entirely not to do it. Editors are practiced at spotting what you may have overlooked, however unintentional. So we can see that editors can be stakeholders in academic writing as one piece of this puzzle. There's a place for editors to support academic writers and scholarly writers generally in producing polished work that upholds ethical principles, that meets supervisor and university expectations, that ultimately reads well for a wider audience, provided that the editing doesn't become cheating. So let's look in a little bit more detail at what I would say are the three key stakeholders of this process: the student, the supervisor, and the editor. The onus for ensuring that the pen stays in the student's hand is on the student. If you're a student, you're the one who is responsible. You have to meet those standards. You're the star of the show. Your supervisor and your editor play supporting roles. Students who want to work with an editor have four key considerations, I'd say. Number one, get permission. Two, allow some time. Expect to be involved in the editing. Three, ask questions. If anything seems fishy to you, if the editor suggests something but you don't understand why, use the editor as a resource to learn more about your writing tendencies. And four, acknowledge the edit. Be above board. There's nothing to hide. And the most important of these considerations is permission, because without it, everything else is irrelevant. That permission is uncommon at the undergraduate level. At the graduate level, it's often now included in program guidelines. For example, this slide shows an excerpt from the University of Calgary's thesis formatting guidelines. It says that if your program allows, you can hire an editor, but before doing so, get the okay from your supervisor. With some programs we work with, graduate students are required to have their papers edited. The edit happens after defense and prior to uploading to a portal. In these cases, we usually assign a statement that we received the file on such and such a date and we returned it on such and such a date, and the student includes that signed statement when uploading. The supervisor roles and responsibilities at the undergraduate level, there's an expectation that students receiving a bachelor's degree are developing their ability to think and write critically. So these profs are going to evaluate the substance of a paper, but they're also going to address errors in formatting, grammar, spelling, and punctuation. At the graduate level, there's an expectation that students already know how to think and write critically, and that it's no longer the supervisor's job to fix their papers. The supervisor's role is to work with the students on the substance of the paper. If it needs editing and the university allows it, the supervisor is likely going to recommend to go get an editor. And at that point, the supervisor's level of involvement varies. A small percentage want to see the editors tracking. This approach tends to be cumbersome and time-consuming, but it does occasionally happen. More commonly, supervisors simply want to review the paper again after it's been edited. They can then see the scope of edit for themselves. Many programs have a list of approved editors, and as long as students are working with someone from that list, the supervisors don't need to see the minutia of what happens with the editing. Or, as I mentioned, the edit happens after defense. Students are judged accordingly, and then the edit happens afterward to polish the paper before it's uploaded to a portal. And that leads to the editor roles and responsibilities. For our part, even though we know the student is responsible for getting permission, we remind students of this responsibility. We have them double check if we've never worked with anyone from their program before. We also advise that they work with us after their content has been approved. This way, the supervisor can better judge their effort, and the student will not have to pay us to review the paper again if the supervisor requests content revisions. As well, editors of academic writing should follow best practices and the guidelines for ethical editing. One best practice is to have a written agreement or a contract that stipulates who's responsible for what. In our terms and conditions, which clients agree to when they first sign up to work with us, we detail the students' responsibilities as well as our own. Nothing about working with an editor should be secretive or furtive. Everything should be out in the open and with the school's blessing. So let's return to our key question. Is it ethical to work with a professional editor? The answer is a resounding yes, but. So you must have permission, and you should work with an editor who follows ethical guidelines. If either of those pillars are not in place, you are taking a risk. So assuming you have permission, what are the guidelines the editor will be following? Well, first of all, there's probably a style guide being used. These include APA style, Chicago style, MLA style, Vancouver style. To give you an example of style guide advice, the 7th edition of the APA manual, which is about a year old now, has a new section in its chapter on writing and grammar. It says, in part, that it highly recommends the use of copy editing services to help prepare a paper. It clarifies that students should verify what kinds of assistance are acceptable. This content was not in the previous edition of the manual, and I think its inclusion in the latest edition speaks to the increasing recognition that a judicious copy edit can indeed benefit all stakeholders and help to uphold rather than undermine academic standards. Canadian editors are also likely following, indeed should be following, Editors Canada guidelines. In 2005, Editors Canada published the first iteration of these guidelines, entitled Guidelines for the Ethical Editing of Theses and Dissertations. And as you can tell from that title, they did not include undergraduate work. The guidelines came about because editing academic work at that time was a bit of the Wild West. Editors were being approached to work on dissertations, but didn't know to what extent that was allowable or reasonable, even though in many cases, students' advisors had told them to get an editor. In 2017, Editors Canada began a consultation process to update the guidelines. A committee gathered feedback from members who had edited academic writing, university writing centers, faculty, and other professional editing groups. And in January of 2019, the committee announced its revised guidelines. They include guidelines for undergraduate texts to address the growing number of clients asking for this service. So the current guidelines include 3 separate documents: guidelines for undergraduate texts, for graduate texts, and a permission form that editors can use and adapt if they wish. In the chat, Helen has the link for you to get to the webpage to check them out if you want. They are a free download. And this is what the page looks like. I'm not going to go into the guidelines in detail. If you're interested, you can download them and read them at your leisure. But let's have a look at them briefly. The undergraduate guidelines state, basically, that editors should restrict their work to flagging problems for potential review. They should not introduce changes or fix the content. Limits are specified that editors should query the student rather than drafting an alternative. So for example, if I read a sentence where the subject and verb do not agree, I should insert a comment saying, please fix subject-verb disagreement. I should not fix the disagreement. And unfortunately, this approach is time-consuming and therefore expensive. It takes a lot longer for me to insert a comment and write, you need a comma here, than it does to just insert a comma. And the undergraduate is going to need time to review all of these comments and revise accordingly. If you're an undergraduate and you want to work with an editor, you should think of it more like coaching. It's not a quick fix or a shortcut to getting better grades. It's an investment in becoming a better academic writer. At the graduate level, we have much more wiggle room. Editors are not restricted to flagging, which means that we can, for example, insert that comma or fix that subject-verb disagreement. Limits are set out based on our professional editing standards. One of our free downloads for you today is a list of the main standards that we apply to student work. Those limits can be narrowed or expanded with supervisor permission. So for example, supervisors are often more lenient with non-native English speakers, or for students who don't have an undergraduate degree, or where the pedagogical aim is not grammatical accuracy. Again, Supervisors and students' primary concern is usually the content, not the spelling and grammar, but they do want that spelling and grammar to be polished for the final submission. So what does all this mean in practice? Well, if undergraduates sometimes have the mistaken idea that we're going to fix everything up and help them get better grades, a common misconception that graduates have is that we're going to help them produce a defensible thesis. And that is not the case. The student's job is to produce a defensible thesis with the supervisor's help. The editor's job, in the words of one program director, is to make sure the thesis is clean. So if a student paper is a room, the student is the homeowner who paints the walls and picks the furniture and arranges everything in a way that makes sense. The supervisor is the interior design expert who says, oh, have you thought about adding this painting? And that chair might be a little out of place. The editor is like the housekeeper who says, let's dust this table and let's arrange these knickknacks and let's get that sock off the floor. And the undergraduate editor is like your kind but judgy friend who points and says, this room would be nicer if you didn't have any socks on the floor. So, okay, moment to breathe. Let me know in the chat if you're still with me.
Karen, it's Sarah here. We have had a little bit of Zoom group chat, and I was just checking in with people here at the university to see, you had mentioned some institutions has lists of approved editors, but so far no one at the University of Calgary on our call today seems to be aware of any such lists at the University of Calgary. So yeah, I think that that's a topic that was of interest and just generated some commentary in the chat.
Yes, to my knowledge, there is no such list at the University of Calgary, but we are on such lists at other universities. And so, I mean, I'd be very interested to, speak with anybody at the university if you're interested in, how would we go about setting up such a list and vet editors to go on it? Because once that list is ready, you might have new editors who inquire to get on the list, but it makes it a lot easier for the supervisor to say, okay, here, I think you need an editor. Here's our list of approved editors. Why don't you go and get quotes from people on this list?
Yeah, maybe you and I can connect afterwards, but I'm interested to know if there's like an example website that people here could go to see what an accredited university, how they would approach that.
Sure, I'd be happy to speak with you afterwards, or maybe we can revisit this when we get to the Q&A portion, if that's something that's really of interest. Okay,
yeah,
great.
You bet, thanks.
Anything else?
That's all that's come in for comments so far.
Okay. Well, with all of that under our belt then, let's examine the nuts and bolts of cleaning up written work. What does an editor do? I'm happy to report that I can answer that question. We do not lie in wait to pounce on your mistakes. However, we really do notice poorly written signage, and we do sigh about it a lot. What we really do in many ways is work not for the client, but for the reader. Because just as it's lovely to spend time in a clean, tidy, and well-organized living room, it's nice to read through a well-edited text. There's nothing to get in our way or distract us. And certainly most students have never worked with an editor before. So let's give an overview of the types of changes an editor might make to your document, just so readers don't trip anywhere. Editing typically falls into 4 big buckets, and we work from the most extensive changes to the least extensive changes. Structural editing, also known as substantive editing or developmental editing, involves revising, reordering, or reworking material in a substantive way. It can include rewriting of that material. It's common in fiction editing, and as you can imagine, it is not common at all in academic editing. The next bucket, stylistic editing, is editing for meaning and flow. That includes such things as eliminating jargon, keeping the language appropriate for the intended audience, adjusting the length and structure of paragraphs or sentences, attending to the document's tone, mood, and voice. Some stylistic editing is allowable in academic work, but it can be an ethical gray zone. The third bucket, copy editing, is editing for grammar, spelling, punctuation, and usage. When clients say, "Can you proofread my paper?" what they're usually really asking for is copy editing. This is where we firmly land when editing academic work, and I will circle back to cover in more detail what copy editing entails. The last type of editing is proofreading. When editors talk about proofreading, we're talking about the final step before publication. Proofreading is checking a work after the editing has been completed for minor misses. Proofreading is not a substitute for editing. So let's loop back to copy editing for a moment. An easy way to think about copy editing is to remember the 4 C's: clarity, coherency, consistency, and correctness, all in service of the cardinal C, communication. A clear, coherent, consistent, and correct document stands the best chance of communicating your message to the reader. So what does copy editing look like exactly when we're talking about academic work? I would say the editor's task is to flag or fix issues in 5 overarching areas. These are not the order in which we'd work on a paper. These are just the types of issues we'd look for. So number 1, we're going to point out mechanical errors and inconsistencies. These are errors in spelling, capitalization, punctuation, abbreviations, italics, numbers. 2, we're going to alert you to errors in grammar, usage, and syntax. That includes word usage mistakes, verb tense, subject-verb agreement, active and passive voice, the formality of the language, sentence and paragraph length, wordiness, jargon, anthropomorphism. At the graduate level, we typically go ahead and insert our suggestions into the document using the track changes feature of Microsoft Word. The third area, errors or inconsistencies in content, we fix the ones that are straightforward and don't involve much decision making, such as your tables or figures are not numbered properly or captioned properly. Other types of content issues we flag, usually by inserting a comment into the document. So we would mark repeated sentences or illogical comparisons, or we'll flag outlining concerns. For example, sometimes a student will have a chapter summary in chapters 2 and 4, but they don't have one in chapter 3. So we would insert a comment and suggest that for consistency, the student add a summary to chapter 3 as well. Under no circumstances would we help the student to write that summary other than reading what had been written and fixing any mechanical or grammatical errors. A fourth area is possible legal trouble spots, such as libel, plagiarism, or missing permissions, and departures from social acceptability, such as bias in your writing or failure to give sources. One of the downloads we've prepared for you today covers some of these ethical concerns. And of course, we're talking here about academic work. So we do all of this with a style guide in mind. There's no point inserting footnotes in a bibliography, for example, if the style guide calls for author date citations and a reference list. So let's recap what we've learned. At the undergraduate level, an editor is more of a writing coach. The editor's role, or anyone else helping the student, is to flag issues and help students understand how to become better writers. The student should not be motivated by getting higher grades, but by reinforcing essential aspects of academic writing, such as citing accurately and avoiding plagiarism. Some editing tasks clearly cross the line and would not be ethical when editing academic work. All of them put the pen into the editor's hand. So reordering or rewriting paragraphs, improving argumentation, providing new evidence, introducing new content, they're all off limits. All of these considerations also apply at the graduate level, but at the graduate level, although we're still acting as a support for stronger writing, not a substitute, we have a lot more leniency. In addition to flagging issues, we can fix inconsistencies in grammar and punctuation. We track our work as we do so. We can format the paper to a specified style guide, such as APA style. We can point out possible trouble spots. And in doing so, we can strengthen the academic integrity of the paper. One of the benefits of working with a professional editor is that a parent or a peer may not know, as well as we do, what is allowable or where the line should be drawn. I think there's a misconception that, it's better to have my mom help me than to hire a professional. And that's not necessarily the case. As you can see from this long list of considerations, there's lots to think about when editing student work. If you are going to hire an editor at some point in your post-secondary journey, here are some considerations to bear in mind. We have the items on this slide and the next available as a free download. So number one, always make sure you have permission. I know I probably sound like a broken record, but permission is fundamental. Two, allow some lead time. Competent professionals are busy, especially at key times of the year, such as March and April. Inquire early. Get yourself into your editor's schedule so you're not disappointed. Next, understand any one of you on the webinar today could put up a website tomorrow and market yourself as an editor. This is an unregulated industry. There's no license to practice editing. So buyer beware. Check the editor's credentials and experience. I don't edit cookbooks or sci-fi novels because I don't know the nuances of those genres. I recommend looking for an editor who's experienced not just with editing, but with editing academic work. Most editors will give free estimates. Some will give free sample edits. Get estimates from a few people and pick the one you like the best. Choosing an editor is much like choosing a supervisor. You want to pick somebody you're going to jive with, who's excited about your topic, and with whom you can work closely as you near completion. And once you've picked that person, you should look for terms of service or an agreement of some kind that outlines in writing who is responsible for what. And once you're working with the editor, you may have some back and forth before the process is complete. So budget time for that process. You can't expect to submit your 200-page dissertation on Thursday and all have it back to you by Friday. The longer the document, the more time you'll need. Be involved and ask questions. Use the opportunity to learn more about your writing strengths and weaknesses. Beware if at any point the editor offers to help you write sections or help you complete the paper. If you have an acknowledgements page, you should acknowledge the editor. And during this process, you should liaise with your supervisor and involve your supervisor according to your supervisor's preferences. And I want to point out that even when all the stakeholders understand their roles and responsibilities, when your supervisor has given permission, when you've chosen an editor with care, this line between cheating and editing can still fall into a gray area. This is especially the case with stylistic editing, which is editing to clarify meaning and refine sentences. Because when does refining cross over into rewriting? And editing for students whose first language is not English can be especially tricky because much more stylistic work is typically required to get the content to be coherent and to flow well. So what is or is not allowable is sometimes a matter of opinion, and those opinions vary. I would say that this topic is an ongoing conversation. It is great to see the University of Calgary stepping up to shine a light on editing student work and maybe generate some discussion. On the one hand, there's legitimate concern that editors might overstep. On the other hand, many feel that admission standards have changed and literacy levels are not what they used to be. Graduate students may not have undergraduate degrees, so they don't have the same level of training in critical writing. Internationalization and inclusion play a larger role on university campuses and have widened the conversation as to what is fair. During the 2-year consultation process to update the new guidelines, the Editors Canada Committee found a spectrum of opinions on editing academic work, and I'd like to share some of that feedback with you as we wrap up today as food for thought. This slide shows a quote from one of the editors who gave feedback during the consultation process. Editors use track changes, which requires the student to work through and accept or reject the recommendation. The editorial decision is in the hands of the student. I think this statement sums up the editor viewpoint well. We track our edits because they're really suggestions. It's up to the student to review those suggestions, ask questions, and decide whether to keep them. An English professor said, if the editor improves the argument or provides new evidence, then she has really become a co-author. And that is not much different than simply paying someone to write your paper for you. This concern speaks to the need for the editor to understand that she is limited in what she is allowed to do. I would say that competent editors understand that limitation, whereas your helpful friend Pat, who's good at English, may not. The pedagogical goal is also important. As this prof noted, no computer science professor wants their students' code being edited, but they might be okay with the introductory paragraph being edited because that's not their main pedagogical goal. Pedagogical goal is one reason that edits to undergraduate work are so limited. In the social sciences, for example, usually the writing itself is a huge part of the goal. And finally, this feedback from the director of a university writing center hits the nail on the head, I think. These guidelines, and here she's referring to Editors Canada 2019 guidelines, they just might make the issue more prevalent and increase awareness among faculty of the need for writing support and writing instruction. Most students turn to illegitimate sources of support because they have no other option. I agree. Most students want to do the right thing. But as I noted when I began this presentation, completing a graduate degree is a considerable undertaking. University resources are limited, and that reality is unlikely to change anytime soon. Supporting students to become better writers and to submit more polished, more cohesive, and more correct papers is a role that professional editors are uniquely qualified to fill. So where do you stand? Please continue the discussion. If you're watching today, your opinion matters. Let us know in the poll. Helen has one last poll for you. If you learned anything in today's presentation, tell us in the chat where you stand. And I'd like to thank everybody for your time, for your attention today. If you're interested in our free downloads, the link is on this slide, but Helen will also share it in the chat. I hope that you will feel free to share your feedback or ask any questions that you have. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Karen. This has been super informative and really well laid out and easy to understand. So thank you so much for that. And I'll turn on my video here so we can have a bit of a chat and interact here as the questions come in. I did have one question that came in privately, and it was regarding the resources. So thank you so much for sharing the free resources on ethical editing. And a question came in that when somebody went to the website to click on each of the 3 resources that look like books, they couldn't get anything. So could you just maybe tell us how to get the resources?
Yes, you actually have to enter your name and email address to opt in to comply with CASL legislation. And so you'll get an email from us with a new link. And using that link, you'll see that all 3 of those book images are clickable hyperlinks, and you'll be able to download it from there.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much for that. And just waiting for any other questions to come in. You did get a question here from a comment from one of the participants to thank you for your wonderful presentation.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
And it looks like Tara has a question. So Tara, we have participant mics turned off. So if you want to maybe type it in the chat, that would be great.
If anybody does have any issues with getting those downloads, or there's some kind of a problem, you can please also just email our office at customer.service@editarians.com, and Claire and I would be happy to help you.
Great, and it looks like we have some results from your poll back. We've got, like, everybody learned something, whether it was a few things or whether they learned loads. So thank you again for that.
Great.
So I did have a question while we're waiting for things to come through the chat box, and you mentioned the relationship between the student and the editor and the supervisor. And so I've had, as a student, I remember having conversations with fellow students. It wasn't my case because I have to say I had an awesome supervisor. But students would say, well, my editor's recommending this, but my prof wants that. So for example, the editor's saying, APA 7, but the prof might still be more familiar with APA 6. So what's the editor's role in resolving conflicts like that?
That is a great question. And these conflicts come up all the time in various ways. I think that now, and I mean from about 2015 forward, the possibilities for friction have decreased because most schools are now following a set style guide, such as APA style. In early years, many universities had their own style guides, and there were often inconsistencies, or there simply just wasn't any information. Our policy is the university standards will trump any guideline. So if a program has its own submission standards that they want the thesis to look a certain way, make your title page this way, do your pagination this way, we will always edit the paper to meet those program guidelines. If the supervisor's request runs obviously counter to APA 7, for example, we would say to the student, okay, well, here's what the manual says, see what your supervisor wants to do. And if the supervisor still wants to keep that, that's what we do. The supervisor's preferences will trump the manual. But I think most supervisors are open to learning more, that they understand that they're not necessarily experts in APA style, they're experts in their topic. And that's their role, is to provide on content and not so much the details of where the comma goes.
Terrific, thanks for that. We had a question come in from Tara as well about what role does a supervisor play in helping a graduate student become a better writer, in helping with more stylistic editing without crossing a line, but to improve the student's communication?
Yes, so I think the supervisor certainly has a lot more leeway than an editor when it comes to stylistic editing, because the supervisor knows what your original contribution was and can have a heavier hand in your document, possibly, because it's the supervisor who's ultimately judging the output. I would just say that most supervisors don't have the time to do that with all of their students to a significant degree. And that is a role that university writing centers will fill, but they are also often under their own constraints. Does that answer your question, Tara?
I think it does. We'll ask her to let us know if it doesn't. And we'll just have one more final call for questions, and just wanted to let you know, Karen, that you're also getting more expressions of gratitude in the chat box, and people are grateful for your presentation today.
Thank you. I can't see the chat. Maybe I should stop sharing my screen and I'll be able to see the chat.
Sure, you can do that. Yeah, we've just got a couple minutes left to do that.
Well, I'm really glad everybody found it helpful and useful. We're certainly happy to have any additional questions that you might have later come to our office. We're also, Claire and I are launching a new aspect of our blog, which is more like a Q&A. If you have a specific question about writing or about APA style, how do I cite a YouTube video comment? You can submit your question and we'll answer them and put them on our blog. So that's something that we're really on the cusp of rolling out fully. So just bear that in mind. If you're a student and you're working on some aspect of your paper and you're hitting a bit of a block and you just need a quick responsive question from a trusted source, we hope that you would think of us to be that source.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom and expertise for us today. It's been eye-opening. I learned things as well, and I've not only been a customer of yours, I'm supervising students as well. So I'm always eager to learn how to support my students better with this work. So we can wrap it up there for today. Thank you everyone for joining us, and a reminder that we have our final webinar for Integrity Week tomorrow, and that will be on FOIP training. We will have Catherine Kinnear and Jennifer Sinclair from our FOIP office to come and talk to us about what information can and cannot be shared when there's a breach, whether it's alleged or actual, of academic integrity at the University of Calgary. So you can sign up for that on the Taylor Institute website, and we'll see everybody back here tomorrow at noon for that webinar. Thanks again to Karen and Claire for sharing your expertise with us.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye.